everyone. Can you hear me okay? And are you all ready there, Anthony? You good?
Yes, I am.
Well, it's great to be with you all this morning. My name's Tim Middleton. I'm a postdoc in Oxford working on religion and climate change. And it's my very great pleasure to be able to introduce Anthony Reddie to you this morning for his keynote talk. So Professor Reddie is the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture at Regent's Park College. He's also an extraordinary professor of theological ethics and a research fellow at the University of South Africa. He's the first Black person to get an A rating in theology and religious studies in the South African National Research Foundation, a designation that means he's a leading international researcher. He's a prolific author of books, articles, chapters, and so forth. He's also the editor of Black Theology, an international journal. And he's the recipient of the Archbishop of Canterbury's 2020 Lambeth Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship, given for exceptional and sustained contribution to Black theology in Britain and beyond. So it's great to have you with us, Anthony. And Anthony's going to be speaking this morning with a paper title, This Monstrous Shadow, Race, Climate and Justice. So over to you, Anthony.
Yes, so thank you. So it's great to be with you this morning. What I want to do is to share something really from a paper that was first developed a couple of years ago when I was working for the Council for World Mission. I claim no great expertise in this area. This was really very much something that was drawn from a conversation I had with a colleague who kind of interviewed me, and I sketched out some ideas and thoughts, which I want to share with you this morning. I want to start with a very, very brief story, a very brief encounter, which for me encapsulates, I think, one of the central challenges when talking about climate justice, which is this asymmetrical impact on its, asymmetrical impact on different sets of people, and how for some it's an abstract concept and for others it's a lived reality. So about 3-4 years ago, a local church in Birmingham, and the guest preacher that morning was a climate justice activist from the Pacific. I think she came from Tuvalu, and she came to preach and to share her personal experiences of living in a context with a low-lying existence on her island, in which several islands are in that part of the world now in danger of disappearing beneath the waves because of climate issues. And so she shared her story, and she got us to imagine how would we feel if parts of our ancestry were to disappear. So she got various of us to talk about where we were born and where we were brought up and where parents were buried, and where many of our ancestors had lived. I said, well, imagine that through no fault of your own, but through the faults of others, through the greed, through capitalism of other parts of the world, whole parts of your existence disappears, that the land on which you have been habitated for millennia, several millennia, that actually disappears. And a major part of your heritage is completely obliterated. What then would that do to your sense of self? What would that do to the way in which you think of yourself as a sentient being and your sense of identity? So she gave that afterwards in the customary nice middle class cups of coffee and kind of insincere conversations that usually take place after church, well, certainly in my church anyway. I got talking to this white guy who kind of, I don't think he's a member of the church. I mean, I'm not that that's any excuse. He could have easily been a member of the church. But I got talking to him, not someone I know particularly well. And he was very skeptical. He said, well, to go to, he said, everything that woman said was just, for me, just largely propaganda. You know, and I don't buy this. It's conspiracy. There's nothing going on here. He says, I stand with Lord Lawson, former Chancellor, that great expert on climate justice. You know, I mean, he wasn't much of a chancellor, but he knows even less about climate justice. But somehow he was one of those at the forefront of denying that there was any significant change in the climate. And so he refuted it completely, said it was conspiracy theory nonsense, and he wasn't buying it. And at that moment, it suddenly hit me that there were these two different discourses going on here. One was from someone sharing their own lived reality of seeing their existence and their way of life disappearing beneath the waves. And someone else who is largely not impacted by it at all, having the luxury of saying that this was some abstract concept that was untrue, distorted, lies, and he rejected her first, and he rejected her lived experience, her personal experience. And it struck me that one of the things that is this asymmetrical tension between the ones who are most responsible are least vulnerable, and the people who are least responsible are the most vulnerable. And we have to try find a way of getting these two discourses to speak to each other. So first thing I want to say is that the climate justice is often characterized as an environmental issue, but actually it's also a matter of global justice. That some in the global north, particularly in major industrialized countries that have developed neoliberal policies, that they suggest that the climate crisis is an exaggerated threat and one they hope to bluff through. They know that if they lose this game of chicken with the environment, they won't be the worst affected. They have the resources to make the best of a bad situation. When climate change impacts on people's lives, the greatest impact is on those in the global south. And this is fundamentally a justice issue. Failure to respond adequately to the climate crisis is to imperil the lives of significant numbers of people who are already the most vulnerable. They are vulnerable in terms of their poverty, the inequalities of global trade, and other aspects of globalization that have already impacted them. In addition to all those problems they are already battling with, that places directly impacted on the climate breakdown that they're now going to have to battle for their very existence. So I think my starting point is to acknowledge that the ones who are most impacted are not adults. That actually, if the continuing trend happens in terms of the rise of temperature and the change in the climate, it'll be a long time before many of us living in the UK so severely impacted that the very nature of our lives will be imperiled. But yet by that point, those most vulnerable will have actually been disappeared already. But I suspect from the lectures that I gave last week at Westminster, I was the week before, one of the losers, but when I given the Eric Symes Abbott lecture, what I say in that lecture is that until we see black bodies, and by black bodies I'm using the political sense, essentially white bodies coming from global south, until we see black bodies as being whole, the truth is that one of the egregious messages we get from the climate justice is that some people, the significant death of other people is a price worth paying in order to maintain the status quo. That actually, if certain parts of the world get decimated and if certain peoples disappear, so what? I suspect for many in the global north be no more significant than disappearance of various species of animals that they don't care about anyway. So basically, species of animals that would seem to be rare in various far-off jungles you can't see are no more significant in their disappearance as would be certain sets of people who are already deemed as inferior and less developed than many people who look like us. By that I mean white people in the global. Therefore, given this differentiation, global north and the global south, is there is there racial dimension to climate justice? I clearly say yes. We don't see it largely because media doesn't tell us these stories. But I certainly found myself very impacted the time I worked for the Council for World Vision, because it's in that context that I, perhaps more than ever before in life, had first-hand encounter with member churches from the Pacific. As I said, some of those Pacific islands have already been evacuated because they are low-lying and the seals have risen, and therefore it makes our present existence unlivable. And I think because we don't have direct relationships with the lived experiences, so for the most part, climate justice is still a philosophical idea for many. It's still an existential threat in the future, not a lived threat now. We don't have any real sense of the existing calamity it is exerted on particular communities as I speak. So to go back to that particular story, this is a woman sharing her pain of seeing ancestral lands disappear. When she invited us to think about what that would mean, so what would happen if I go back to Bradford, West Yorkshire, Eastbourne, which is where I was born, where I spent my first 19 years, and suddenly that's just gone. How do I understand myself as Anthony Reddie when all the formative places that helped to shape me actually no longer exist? How would many of us feel in our context where homeland, where the place where we have a sense of rootedness? So one of the things that pastoral theologians, particularly colonial scholars, often talk about is that as human beings, we are often a negotiation between the root R-O-O-T and the root R-O-U-T-E. Obviously, it works in English. In American English, where it's root and route, it's not quite the same thing. But certainly, root and root, the R-O-O-T is a formative anchoring. Those are the places and the space and the context, space and time that informs us. It gives us our sense of anchor to a particular place. Obviously, the root, the R-O-U-T, are both the metaphorical and physical journeys we take that often then form, challenge, disrupt, augment something of the root. But everyone knows that if you don't have R-O-O-T, a sense of rootedness in a place and a space with formative relationships, it has a huge deleterious impact on one's sense of self and one's being. And yet that is what's happening as we speak. And even as people are sharing stories, there are still figures of us in the industrialized north, west, who will utterly refute it. So in a sense, imagine how catastrophic it would be for identity and self-understanding. And yet somehow, when it happens in faraway places, in bodies that don't look like us, as depicted in the media, it still goes unreported. First day in Oxford, when I started as the director of the Centre for Religion and Culture, but as I started, I was the director designate. I went to an annual lecture, a David Nichols lecture that was held at Regents, and the speaker was a climatologist, Dr. Leon Seeley Huggins, who was based at Warwick University. And he gave his paper on the apocalyptic nature of climate justice. He's Caribbean, where both he and I have our family heritage. And there was something he said that chilled me to the bone, that while some powerful elites in the West are climate deniers, others accept it will happen, but are working on the basis that some collateral damage is acceptable. There are powerful people who can countenance other people dying and cultures disappearing. If that's what it takes for everyone else to continue, if only for a period, with some sense of normality, then that's a price worth paying. We still want to grow, we still want to consume, we still want to pursue a form of rapacious capitalism. If some Caribbean or Pacific islands disappear, then that's just the price we pay for more civilized people to continue their lifestyles unchanged and unchecked. What was so chilling to me was the thought that some of the people who think this way could also be right-wing evangelical Christians, particularly in North America. The notion of sacrifice, especially if it involves someone else's sacrifice, is something that they can build into their understanding of the world because of the way in which we often theologize around Jesus' sacrifice. Jesus says, if you want to follow me, pick up your cross, deny self, and follow me. Of course, we're being very selective about who we want to pick up the cross and who should be willing to sacrifice. Inevitably, it's not the people who are using the rhetoric. It's imposed on others who don't have the choice. And so there's a huge race element involved that we're not seeing. But I think there's a theological issue here in that when we've often thought about the sacrificial nature of Jesus' ministry and we think of the cross, it's often the vulnerable who are asked to carry the cross. It's often the vulnerable who are asked to live out an expression of kenosis, of self-emptying. It's invariably not the powerful. So we often, certainly women's theology, talk about a vicarious way in which white hegemony often used the black bodies as official motifs to talk out a sacrifice and the struggle of following Jesus. It's usually a rhetorical one because it's usually aimed at other people to sacrifice that doesn't require those who are powerful to do. Therefore, it seems to me that what we have to do is to push away these elements of climate justice because they sometimes make us feel uncomfortable. We don't like to talk about race, full stop. It's often the elephant in the room. We try to abstract it and we try to deflect it by looking at other things. I've lost count the number of times to colleges and churches in order to talk race and particularly to talk about white privilege. And all of a sudden, people want to talk about interfaith. Suddenly they want to talk about gender and sexism. Suddenly they want to talk about class and poverty. Now, don't get me wrong, these are all important things to talk about, but it's interesting in that they weren't interested in talking about them until I turned up in order to talk about race. And therefore, not talk about race, we'll talk about anything else but that. So we have to be clear that climate catastrophe has been triggered by the rise of capitalism, exploiting resources and using them remorselessly for growth and profit. That process isn't new. At the moment, we're doing that to the environment. But like we used to do that to people. As C.D. Huggins also points out, the slave trade was underpinned by rampant greed and profit and the displacement and exploitation of bodies. So once we've done that, we then move on to the environment. Grabbing fossil fuels to drive growth. It's interesting that certainly if one looks at the work of CARICOM, which is the Caribbean, it's a Caribbean sort of trading community amongst the Caribbean islands. And the work that's been done there looking at reparations is linked to climate justice, because what many of the activists said, particularly people like Professor Vereen Shepherd and Professor Hilary Beckles, is that long before there was the exploitation of the environment, of the climate, there was the exploitation of people. The taking around of 12 million black bodies from West and Central Africa to the so-called New World for profit. And I say 12 million people, that's just the ones who made the journey, because what it's often estimated is that about 1 in 4 were either thrown overboard for insurance purposes there are others who literally also threw themselves overboard in the midst of existential despair. It's why sometimes post-colonial scholars will call it the Black Atlantic, because we don't know how many black bodies are lying at the bottom of it, and it is a site of misery and existential crisis and oppression. So there's a historic linking here about how we think about climate injustice and its impact specifically on black bodies. So the impact of climate change on black and brown bodies of the people comes on the back of 500 years of exploitation of their bodies anyway. It's a compound disaster, adding injustice to another, one injustice to another. This is so deeply etched into our way of being that it's what I call this monstrous shadow. And it's a shadow that we don't even talk about. Because if we do, we'd have to go right back to the very basis of why some countries are rich and why some are poor. So we talk about the Industrial Revolution. I guess we learned that at school in our history books. And how it transformed Britain from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse. What we never talk about, invariably never talk about, is the fact that the capital for this industrialization came from slavery. It came from the exploitation of the people who are now most imperiled by climate change. So the people who suffered 500 years ago are the same ones who are suffering now. And the utter disregard that was given to black bodies 500 years ago. It took a long time for the abolitionist movement to take off. The first abolitionists, long before Wilberforce and anyone else, were the enslaved Africans themselves who were saying, but we are not chattel, we are human beings, you should not treat us like this. But of course, so long as they were saying it, it didn't matter because they were not human and their voices and their lives had no attritional, well, their lives and experiences had no impact on the largely metropolitan north. And so for the most part, that did not trigger any significant or substantive change in people's relationships to black people. Just as they were ignored all those years ago, and it wasn't until white abolitionists then suddenly said, but actually this is wrong, that suddenly other white people began to listen. They certainly never listened to Africans. And there's a sense in which now, as much as I admire Greta Thunberg, it's interesting that it takes a woman from the industrial north in order for people to pick up and listen. Long before that, there were people from those various cultures, like this woman from Overloo, who were saying, our lived experience is this, and people are still not listening. So as a theologian, it seems to me that one of the critical questions we have to ask is how can our theology either help or hinder our understanding of these issues? It seems to me that one of the obvious things we have to do, and I say this with a little bit of embarrassment because I suspect it's, well, not suspect, I know it's nothing original. There are others like Tim and other people who are at the sharp end of doing much more developed work than I'm doing here, who will say this and hopefully say it much more eloquently than myself, is that we need to dispense with what is often called dominion theology. It's the idea that God has given us dominion of the earth for us to do what we like with it. I think it's a complete misreading. I say that as one who has always had to depend on the biblical skills of other people. It is a joke I often tell to some of my students that when I was doing my undergraduate studies about 35 years ago, in church history, actually, not in theology, but I was very interested in theology. So there were additional classes that one could take if you were very, very keen on Greek and Hebrew. So I did go to a couple of biblical language classes, but after about 2 or 3 lessons, certainly the professor of Greek, Anthony, said, for your he said, for time and my sanity don't come back. Because like you have no aptitude whatsoever for these biblical languages and you waste time. So anyway, so I never that. So all that to say that in terms of the exegesis of how we think about the dominion, I'm dependent upon other people far brighter than myself. But I think I'm completely saying from everything I have read and heard from experts, particularly in terms of the Hebrew scriptures and looking at doctrines of creation. So it's a misreading in terms of when we think about dominion, meaning that somehow it gives us a blank check to do as we please. But if it were accurate, that needs to come to an end anyway. We are custodians of something that we did not create. And once we exploit it, we can't recreate it. And I think it's interesting to say that because I think the hubris that comes out of a Western intellectual tradition, certainly a post-Enlightenment tradition, is this notion, it's not what Willie James Jennings calls cult of mastery. So when James Jennings talks about whiteness, and one could frame the whole of this paper and the whole of our justice conversation on within the framework of whiteness, which is just about the epidermis of those socialized as white. So it's not attack on white people, but it's attack on the various cultures and intellectual frameworks that come out of kind of Europe, seeing itself as the apex of human development and civilization. That this sense of mastery, this sense of wanting to exert control of things and over people, is a kind that then finds itself whereby you use resources almost with a kind of impunity on the assumption that somehow we have the skill and the technology to make God and to recreate it, and we can't do it. It's interesting that when in different texts when I talk about theological anthropology, what it means to be a being and a creature, and not to be God, and to see ourselves as creatures, not creators. It's interesting that when you look at Mary Shelley's story of Frankenstein, it's interesting that Frankenstein isn't the monster. Frankenstein is the scientist who thinks to play God. Actually, in the original text, that monster has no name. And it's interesting in the crime I think Frankenstein is that he's trying to play God. He wants to be a creator, but we are that. We are creatures, and therefore I think there has to be a sense of limits and boundaries, and that curtail our natural will to power, believes that we can just remorselessly continue on a particular line, consuming and looking for ongoing forms of growth without realizing the impact it has both upon creation but upon the most vulnerable. On the positive side, it seems to me that there is a helpful perspective in what is often called process theology. Process theology makes a distinct switch in thinking about God and creation. Historically, we've thought of God being separate from creation, as this being is not defined by space and time, as a relationship beyond creation. Process theology asks whether God is in fact not external, but locked into this creation with us. And therefore, when we are mistreating creation, we are mistreating God. Now, obviously, this is often seen as problematic. It can slip into Satanism and other seemingly problematic areas of theology, certainly in terms of how we think of that in Orthodox Christian theology. But I find valuable, it gives us a powerful context for this unique creation, this special place in the whole cosmos. That I think that we can think of God with us here in the mess as an active participant, helping us to fix the situation. But God is not external to it. It might be considered unorthodox. But I can live with our heresy if our unorthodoxy is leading us to protect creation. Or put another way, if our heresy means we're calling into question an orthodox theology that often leads us to a theology of dominion and to the oppression of of the creation. There's a great song by Sweetheart the Rock called If the Earth Could Run Away. And what they do in that song is that they liken the earth to a woman who is suffering from domestic violence, and says, well, actually, if the earth could run away, she would take all the various creatures with her, but leave humankind behind. Humankind is analogous to the male partner who is beating the crap out of her. And she would run away, and God would go with her, and they would leave us behind because we are the problem. It's not all the other creatures. It's certainly not God. It's us who are trying to play God. And so alongside new theological understanding, I think the question comes, what can the church do practically to address these inequalities? Well, it seems to me that the first thing we have to acknowledge is that for most of us, we can't change the whole world. So therefore, what's the little we can do within our control? How do we help congregations to think about their buildings, and how to help them to, how can they operate in a more ecological way? This might seem small, but if you multiply those actions across churches, that in itself might well be significant. Even if it's not significant, it would be symbolically powerful. And I find that interesting that I've often had people come to me and say, oh, yeah, but, I mean, what's the point of symbols? Like, really? So, like, as a Christian, you're asking the question, what is the point of symbols? I mean, can any religion that would operate without symbols and without the way in which symbols shape an alternative reality in our imagination, that I think is hugely important. It seems to me that what we have to challenge is the despair that often people feel over climate injustice. Knowing that we can make a difference even at a local level, even at a symbolic level, I think empowering. On a bigger scale, I'm reminded of a colleague at Coventry University who says that churches are good at social welfare, but not good at social action. We're good at helping out when there's a problem, but not so good at using our influence to lobby politically on systemic injustices. Like, we have a general election coming up next year. And it seems to me one of the critical things we can do, given that we live in a democracy, as problematic as democracy is, and it's not often that I agree with Winston Churchill. Actually, the only time I ever agree with Winston Churchill is on his dictum that democracy is a terrible idea, a terrible way in which to run it, except for all the other ideas. So as problematic as democracy is, we get to go to the ballot box and we get to make a decision on who will run us. And it seems to me that if we are serious about climate justice, what we have to do is to say, this is the prevailing issue of our time. Which is a party that will take this the most seriously? And that's where we'll put our vote. And for me, to be blatantly honest about liberation theologians, I despair that those who vote for the Conservative Party and then claim to have even a modicum of concern for justice, whether it's justice for human beings who are the poorest, or whether it's actually globally justice for the climate and for the people who are the most vulnerable. It cannot be put in the hands of people who want to conserve and exist in a status quo that has largely imposed misery upon the poorest of the world, and certainly the poorest in this country. Years ago, a former president of America, Bill Clinton, once famously said, "It's the economy, stupid." And as Christians, we need to say, we will support politicians who say it is the environment, stupid. We believe in a God who has given us this creation, a gift bestowed upon us for our safekeeping for future generations. What would happen if we as a movement of churches supported candidates or parties that put the environment first? Most economic growth is irresponsible. Consumption is irresponsible. And clearly we need to change. We should support visionary politics that tells the truth about these things. We cannot continue to grow exponentially. That said, history tells us that power is never conceded. You have to make change happen. And direct action, peaceful, is probably the best way, but quite frankly, if one has to make a point to the powerful enough that says that our discourse needs to change, our practices need to change, then so be it. People are dying and cultures are disappearing as we speak. Maybe the time for politeness and niceness have come to an end. 100 years ago, Emily Pankhurst and the suffragettes were using tactics of disruption to make a political point. In some regards, this was involved there too, because the movement was predominantly of entitled white middle-class women. That did not invalidate what they were doing, but there are similar questions, therefore, for me around Extinction Rebellion. But that does not invalidate what they're doing either. But I do think there are some critical questions about who constitutes the makeup of Extinction Rebellion, and whether if we're not careful, it becomes another type of white savior syndrome. So in conclusion, it seems to me at what point, what advice would I offer? As someone who's not a specialist in this at all, but has been invited nonetheless to give a keynote talk. That I would want to see this movement diversify and to be more inclusive. I will admit that I find it hard to be a part of Extinction Rebellion. For me and many Black people, the idea of deliberately getting yourself arrested assumes a certain level of security and safety around your body and around how you'll be treated by the police when you're put into custody. And as that middle-class man who has a good facility with language and has degrees, so has letters in front of his name and letters behind his name, I still do not feel safe when I'm in the company of police. So the idea that I would deliberately get myself arrested assumes a certain level of white privilege around white bodies, particularly white middle-class bodies. I'm not disposed to make myself vulnerable to arrest voluntarily. But to be clear again, that does not invalidate those who are prepared to do it. So it seems to me that one of the powerful ways in which white people can be allies around those who are the most marginalized and the most vulnerable to climate justice is by the willingness to be arrested, because we know the police treat white middle-class people entirely different from how they treat Black bodies. That is just a historic fact. And therefore, actually, it may well be one of the powerful ways which people can be allies, and to think of sacrificial ways of living when we talk about picking up the cross and following Jesus is the cross of being arrested, of being seen as a subversive other, to be seen as a disruptive element, because one has the privilege of being able to do that, because the truth is actually that the police are not going to beat the shit out of white middle-class people in the same way they will with impunity seemingly kill Black bodies in police custody. So finally, what we need is a range of strategies so that people can participate without assuming that there's only one approach for everyone. I would find it difficult to get myself arrested, but there are other ways in which I can contribute to this movement. But it starts with dialogue. Extinction Rebellion can begin conversations with different Black communities, and we can work out what point of entry could be. We should ask how we can support each other in the different tactics that we can use, acknowledging that we are all on the same side because it's the one creation that all of us share. It's not about saying, let's dialogue with Black communities so that they can come and join us, because that presumes that power lies with you. We mustn't assume that others aren't doing anything either. A better question is to inquire about what they are doing and how can we support that. Race is a complicated issue, but there are bigger issues that we need to come together around, because ultimately this is about capitalism and exploitation and growth. And the status quo has to be critiqued, challenged, and changed. The final thing I would say is, well, two final quotes, which I probably overused over the last 2 or 3 years, but I still think they're so good that I invariably always end with them. So first comes from Desmond Tutu, who says, if you think you're too small to make a difference, then you've never shared a bed with a mosquito. And I think what all of us can be, at the very least, is a mosquito. Now, to be very quickly, first time I told this, and someone said, oh yeah, but don't mosquitoes kill people through malaria? Okay, it's a metaphor, literal. We're not literally endorsing mosquitoes. I can't stand it. But I think what mosquitoes can be is that certainly I have shared many of them with a mosquito when I go see my parents in Jamaica. And the interesting thing is sometimes I don't sleep at night because I'm so fearful of them biting me. They don't bite me, but just the very fact that they're there forces me to consider my existence, and that's in the same space. I think if the very least we could do as Christians is to be such agitants and to be so subversive and disruptive that this monstrous body that's called global greedy capitalism knows that we're present and knows that life cannot continue as normal because we are not going away. So that's the first one. Final word, actually comes from the great James Baldwin, who says this: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. That's me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Reddie. Kevin, I'm very aware of the time. Do we want to break now or have a question?